And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, Jason Gerald with us, an investigative historian, archaeologist, public speaker, and other than ancient history, his studies include philosophy, comparative mythology, religion, depth psychology, and he's a frequent guest on numerous shows, radio shows, podcasting, focused on ancient history, cultural studies. Also has appeared on Ancient Aliens, our television series. Jason, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, George. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here.
I'm looking forward to this. How did you get involved in studying ancient giants?
Well, I have always been interested in the Bible, mythology, and other subjects that are sort of related. And many years ago, I discovered some articles written by Ross Hamilton that clearly demonstrated that the tall ones could be found in the actual archaeological record and not just in hundreds of old press accounts. So that got my attention. And then after moving to West Virginia about 10 years ago, my wife Sarah and I learned that we were living on top of the former location of an ancient stone mound, which was surveyed by the Smithsonian in 1883. And so we started looking into the mound builders. And we realized very quickly that the large skeletal remains were not only very real, but that they had been found and acknowledged by antiquarians and archaeologists between the late 1800s all the way up to about 1970. And so once we knew that there was a very real mystery underlying all of the subjects, we decided to launch our own investigation and find out what we could learn about the people behind the myth, so to speak. And one aspect of our project required around 4 years of study of archaeology to learn the cultural history of North America going back many thousands of years, basically so that we would be able to learn more about how old these people were, how they lived, and which cultures they were a part of.
And you keyed in on North America, even though the giants are worldwide, right?
Well, our project actually includes the entire world.
Does it? Okay.
It's just that we're publishing the results of our research in increments because we've come to the conclusion that many of these cultures are actually unrelated. So this is a phenomenon that seems to appear in many different segments of the human gene pool in the ancient past.
When we talk about giants, Jason, what are we talking about? How tall?
Well, we refer to these people as the North American giants, mainly because that is the term by which most readers and listeners recognize the topic. But this is probably not a completely accurate term for these people. The great Native American scholar Vine Deloria Jr. published a book called Red Earth, White Lies in 1995, in which he described his conversations with tribal elders in the U.S. regarding these ancients. And the tribal elders consistently referred to them as the tall ones. And I believe this is a more suitable term for what we have learned concerning their anthropology. The tall ones represent a distinct but integrated segment of the prehistoric population in North America. They were living among the rest of the ancient Americans for thousands of years, and the traits which made them unique were their very large stature, thick, large skull vaults, and pronounced facial features, massive and powerful lower jaw bones, and extremely powerful builds. Many archaeologists who've studied their skeletons have written about the evidence of a powerful muscular system that are observable in the skeletal remains. Now, concerning the height, most of the reliable reports that we have found are describing people between 7 and 8 feet in height.
Okay.
With a lesser number of reliable reports giving heights of between 8 and 9 feet. Another fact that needs to be emphasized is that this was not a particular race or species of giants. The tall ones universally represent members of populations who were generally of average stature.
Now, these giants that we're talking about, biblically speaking, are they the Nephilim?
Well, there are people who believe that, and I do believe that there are giants from the ancient world who are the Nephilim, because I am a biblical believer. However, it is not my opinion that the North American giants are the Nephilim. Now, that being said, I do respect other people's right to form their own opinion, because that's what this is all about.
What happened to the giants, Jason? I mean, where'd they go?
Well, that's a very important question. One of the things that people need to realize when we study ancient cultures in North America is that with the arrival of Europeans, disease and slavery and several other aspects of the things that happened when Europeans colonized North America actually wiped out somewhere between 60 and 70% of the ancient lineages of Native American people. So many of them were probably a part of lineages that are now extinct, but which were encountered by early European explorers. Aside from that, what may surprise a lot of people to learn is that the tall ones actually persisted into the 20th century, and there are just as many press accounts and anthropology studies of living descendants of these people as there are of the ancient skeletons. And one of my favorite examples of that is a gentleman named Max Palmer, who was born in 1927. Max was of part Cherokee ancestry, and he was actually in several science fiction films in the 1950s, including Invaders from Mars. Max stood 8 feet 2 inches tall.
Jeez.
And the doctors knew from studying him that he did not suffer from giantism. He had an incredibly athletic build. In fact, he was a professional wrestler who called himself Paul Bunyan in the ring. And in 1963, Max became a born-again Christian. He called himself Goliath for Christ, and he preached the gospel until his death in 1984. But being of Cherokee ancestry connects Max to several ancient cultures that the remains of the tall ones have been found in their tombs, including the proto-historic Iroquois, the Susquehanna, and the Conisty Hopewell mound builders of the South. And that's just one example. There are many hundreds of examples of living Native Americans who still possessed this unique anthropology well into modern times.
These giants that died off, what do you think the population size could have been? Are we dealing with hundreds or thousands? What do you think?
Well, that's another important question. I can refer you to the works of several mainstream archaeologists who acknowledged the tall ones, including William S. Webb and Don Dragoo. They were writing in the 1950s and the 1960s. We know that there were enough of them that this is not something that can be explained as several people have tried to do in modern times, as just occasionally tall people. But we also know that due to the widespread practice of cremation in these ancient cultures, we really have no way of knowing how many people possess these features, because cremation was a very prevalent burial practice between about 4000 BC and 1000 AD in North America. But the archaeologists I mentioned, along with several physical anthropologists, have found evidence in the bones that have been recovered from cremations to suggest that many people in the cremation burials were also of this unique physical type.
In your research, did you stumble across anything that you would say was just so compelling that you put it in your book, Ages of the Giants?
Well, certainly the most compelling aspect of our work really comes down to the credentialed sources. That is, the sources for the discovery of these remains that come from actual archaeological reports. And what I can do is walk you and the audience through several of the professional reports.
Okay.
So in 1883 and 1884, Colonel Norris of the Bureau of Ethnology of the Smithsonian investigated 50 Adena burial mounds at Charleston, West Virginia. And his report that he filed with the Smithsonian actually mentions the discovery of several skeletons he measured of very large proportions. And one of these came from the Great Smith Mound, which was number 21 of the Charleston group. And the Smith Mound was around 35 feet high. And within the mound, Norris discovered a large timber house-like structure. And this structure was 13 feet long and 12 feet wide, reaching as high as 9 feet with a sloping roof. And he found 6 burials in the structure, and this that I'll read now is an exact quote from Norris's own field manuscript. At 19 feet and the bottom of this debris, we find together, with the fragments of a rotten bark coffin, a gigantic human skeleton 7 feet 6 inches in length. So, one of the interesting things about this discovery is that it was mentioned in the November 20th, 1883 edition of the New York Times. But the New York Times mentioned the skeleton as being only 7 feet in length. So you'll notice that in this instance, not only is the large skeleton reported by the press confirmed in an official archaeological report, but the press mistakenly recorded the length of the skeleton as 5 or 6 inches shorter than it actually was. And Norris found several other skeletons in Charleston, published in his report as 7 feet long. Another really interesting account comes from Ohio. And this was roughly contemporaneous with the digs of the Smithsonian. On May 31st, 1897, the Daily Public Ledger reported the following discovery. 10 skeletons were found in 2 mounds by Dr. Loveberry, curator of the Ohio State University Museum, one that of a giant fully 8 feet tall. So it turns out that Clarence Loveberry did excavate 2 mounds on the Briggs Farm in Union Township near Chillicothe in May of 1897.
Jeez.
And the following passage is taken from his official report. This is Loveberry. He says, "In the central part of the structure, we found a 4th skeleton. The bones were the largest I ever removed from a mound. All joints were exceedingly massive, and the muscular attachments were wonderfully developed." So there are numerous accounts like this throughout the 1800s and 1900s, which in many instances corroborate and confirm the press reports that so many of us have seen.
Jason, have you heard that the Smithsonian has many of these skeletons and they keep it quiet?
Well, I have heard that. I do not believe that the remains of the tall ones are still in the possession of the Smithsonian, but considering that there are thousands of skeletons still scattered in the Smithsonian vaults, it wouldn't surprise me if some of them were there just as a matter of circumstance. There are several locations in North America where we believe the remains are being kept of several of these skeletons, but none of those are directly affiliated with the National Museum.
Now, in terms of the tall ones, were they particularly did they have any special powers during their moment? I mean, were they like leaders and kings or anything like that?
So that really depends on the time period. Our first research project covers about 4,000 years in North America, and we have analyzed the social structure and material culture of 4 major prehistoric cultures that had these people among them, and each one is different. But the culture that's probably the most important in this respect is the Adena mound builder culture, which dates to between 1000 BC and 300 AD here in the Ohio Valley. And what we know from research into their social structure, it seems that these people actually lived under a heterarchy. And in a hierarchical society, people rise to the occasion to fulfill social roles, such as the leader of the hunt or the shaman, basically on a situational basis. And then after, the chore or the task is finished, they don't typically exercise power over the rest of the population. So at least in the context of the mound builder culture, it doesn't seem that these individuals had any type of hereditary power. We see some of the remains of the tall ones, such as a large skeleton found at the Cresap Mound here in West Virginia, which are found with lots of exotic and prestigious artifacts, which could indicate a type of high status. But on the other hand, we have instances from Kentucky of the same culture burying gigantic skeletons with no artifacts, which would seem to indicate that that individual didn't hold much of an important social position.
It is truly remarkable that they would be all over the world and then simply die off or vanish. Could they have been extraterrestrial, or do you think they were human types?
Well, having studied numerous anthropological papers that have photographs of these remains, I would refer people to a couple of excavation reports from here in the U.S. One is the Dover Mound by William S. Webb, and another is Mounds for the Dead by Don Dragoo. These people seem, to me at least, to be human beings. They lived and died as human beings. Their diets seem to have been the same as those of what we would consider normal human beings. Sometimes we see mounds where a very large skeleton is buried with a member of the opposite sex and a child, which archaeologists feel could represent a family crypt.
Did you come across any interesting incidents that would baffle us?
Well, we actually have come across a lot of instances of grave robbing.
Really?
Yes, there's, for example, and this is just one of numerous examples, there was a burial mound here in West Virginia that was excavated in 1929, and the excavator discovered 2 large skeletons. One was around 7.5 feet long, and the other one was considerably larger. We're not sure how large, but there have been estimates as large as 9 feet. And the larger skeleton was actually stolen by an assistant to the excavations who took it home. And we've actually seen personal correspondence in the form of letters which prove that the larger skeleton was actually stolen again from the home of the person who took it from the site. An interesting note with this case is that the same mound was excavated again in 1960, and yet another assistant to the excavations stole another large skeleton, and that individual, upon his death, illegally sold those large remains on the black market to a wealthy elite buyer.
How much do you think that the bones would go for?
Well, I'm not sure, but I find it very disturbing that, in a time that close to us today, that people were that ambitious about collecting unusual skeletons.
Oh, they'll buy anything, Jason.
Apparently they will. Money talks, as they say.
Yep.
Compared to that, George, I would point out that on the other end of the spectrum, for example, I was doing a conference in Ohio a couple years ago, and a retired archaeologist approached me, and he introduced himself, and he says, I was there in the 1960s when the Ohio Historical Society found one of these large skeletons in a mound in Ohio. And I asked him what happened to the bones, and he told me that the lead archaeologist had merely thrown them in the trash.
Jeez.
So really, in some instances, they've been considered highly valuable. In other instances, they've just been discarded.
Is it possible that the tall ones are being confused with Bigfoot nowadays?
Well, I think that when we look at things like Bigfoot, it's important to remember that the Native American people seem to be describing something which interacts with the human realm, but which does not always live in human culture. The tall ones, on the other hand, were parts of human societies for millennia. These were people, they lived among people. So I believe that there's certainly a distinction there between the North American giants and the mythic concepts like the Wendigo and the Bigfoot.
Cahokia Mounds near St. Louis has a huge mound. Is it conceivable that some of the tall ones are buried there?
It's highly conceivable. The entire St. Louis area used to be the home of around 100 burial mounds. As the area was developed over time, numerous large skeletons were found in some of the larger mounds, some of them 7 or 8 feet tall. And Cahokia, as a Mississippian site, the Mississippian culture dates between roughly 900 AD and around 1600 AD. Some archaeologists believe that Cahokia may have been founded by a group that migrated from out of the Ohio Valley, which is actually the location of older cultures which had hundreds of large skeletons in their tombs.
And Jason, we were talking before the break about the possibility that these tall ones could be of extraterrestrial origin, and then the break goddess. Let's talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, well, in my opinion, the tall ones around the world, because if we're going to compare these with other large skeletons from other areas, it's important to point out that even in Europe, for instance, the tall ones in Europe are found in copper, bronze, and Iron Age tombs, and in the East, they're found in contemporary tombs for Amorite cultures from the Middle Bronze Age. So we see them scattered throughout the world, and I would like to point out that the DNA tests that have been done on all these peoples clearly show us that they are not closely biologically related with recent ancestors. So if there is a common X factor which has influenced the genes of all these people, it must be tens of thousands of years old. So to answer a question like that, we would need to go back even further in time, I think, in the study of this phenomenon than has been done before.
Now, the story of David and Goliath, he was one of them, wasn't he?
Well, I've seen estimates for the height of Goliath that range from 8.5 feet to over 9 feet. Certainly, we have remains that have been found in North America of a comparable size to Goliath. It's also important to point out that when we look at the biblical giants, these people were warriors and kings. Clearly, this was not a case of giantism. And that's another feature of the anthropology that we see of the tall ones in the record, is that these were people with athletic builds of good health. So Goliath would be very similar in features to some of the tall ones that archaeologists have exhumed.
In terms of investigating, is anybody conducting archaeological digs for these bodies and these skeletons?
Well, archaeologists in the 20th century were still recovering these skeletons and writing about them in their reports. I mentioned William S. Webb and Don Dragoo before the break. There are always digs being done in the mounds of these cultures. The graves of the ancients in North America are an ongoing subject of intense archaeological research. One of the things that I would like people to know is that there are numerous methods for measuring skeletons when they're found in the tombs. And regression formulas can allow for an archaeologist to give a measurement of a skeleton that's as much as a foot shorter than what it actually is. So with that kind of practice available, it's difficult to say how many of them are or are not being found today.
What baffles you the most about your work, Jason? I mean, if there was something that you could solve and fix, what would that be?
Well, I believe, as I stated before, it is my opinion that these are human beings, and I think that the important aspect of this work is really trying to figure out what this means about our own ancestry. You know, you've mentioned several times that these have been found throughout the world, and that's absolutely true. And the real mystery is, why did they exist? What does this mean for the history of humankind and for the anthropological history and destiny of our race?
I interviewed a pilot several years ago who flew out a skeleton from Iraq and Afghanistan. Is it conceivable that some of these creatures, maybe I should even call them creatures if they were humans, are still around somewhere?
Well, in terms of North America, we know that from DNA tests and linguistic studies, we've been able to trace the descendants of the ancient giants in North America to existing Native American people. And a part of the project that I'm involved in right now involves tracking down the tall ones who are still with us today. And I can certainly tell you that there are still people born with these genetics today among the Native American population, and many of them are professional athletes, which isn't surprising. So, yes, to answer your question, there are still people of this heritage living in North America in the present era.
Could there be something evil about these giants? Anything like that?
Well, that depends on which part of the world we're talking about and which group of giants.
Okay.
I think certainly if we look at some of the Bronze and Copper Age giants from Western Europe and the ancient East, we even know that those individuals, DNA studies have shown that they may have originated in ancient Sumeria during the time of the Tower of Babel. So we may consider an evil influence in that realm, but in terms of the people who were living here in North America, since they are a distinct people, the answer to that question isn't quite as clear-cut. But as I said before, many of their societies were not hierarchical. These were more egalitarian-type societies.
What else are you working on these days, Jason?
Well, we're currently working on the follow-up to our first book, and it's going to reveal our own theory of the origins of these people and also trace them through time to living Native American tribes.
Would we be in shock when you get the results?
I think that a lot of people will be, actually. I know, because it really surprised me. It's actually very surprising how much you can actually learn about these people, both their ancient ancestors and their modern descendants. I know that for many years, it seemed that there was a veil between us and the tall ones, that they existed on the other side of some impenetrable wall, and we couldn't really know anything about them. But the archaeological literature actually tells us a great deal, and we're also going to be getting into their mythology and cosmology a lot more in the future.
Was there a social status to these giants in terms of how they lived during any particular time period?
Well, the societies evolved over time. For example, around 1500 BC in the Great Lakes area, there were several regional centers which developed. And in these centers, there were people that variously are referred to as big men or aggrandizers by archaeologists. But what they really were individuals who controlled the economy, especially resources that people would need to survive, like the fishing industry. And these individuals actually oversaw marriage alliances and various other aspects of human life, and it had a remarkable impact upon the population. But then, around 1000 BC, the societies began to become more egalitarian. Interestingly enough, you mentioned Cahokia.
Mm-hmm.
During the age of Cahokia, we see the rise of elite chiefdoms that passed on their status to their descendants, and these individuals were sort of presenting themselves as the incarnation of a sun god. And there were many, many large skeletons found in the tombs of the elite Mississippians. So it changed over time. It sort of fluctuated, just like our society does today.
Is there going to be a dramatic epiphany about, these individuals, these tall ones? Will it ever become so public that everybody will know about it?
I think that what's going to occur is a lot of the more scholarly research that some people are doing is going to be entertained by a new generation of archaeologists who are probably going through the university circuits now. And these people will probably double-check some of the things that you and I are talking about tonight. And what we'll probably see is a gradual and very cautious acknowledgement of the reality behind this phenomenon.
If you could talk to one of these giants, what would you ask it?
Oh, wow. Well, there's a lot. There's a lot that I would ask it. I would want to know really the meaning of some of the artifacts that they're buried with, because the people in these cultures created some of the most remarkable copper and shell objects in the history of the world. In fact, North American copper miners in the Great Lakes by 6000 BC were creating advanced copper tools for hunting and fishing. And that really gave them a technological leg up on the rest of the world, because it would be another 3,000 years before any society in the ancient world was fabricating comparable tools. So I would be really interested in learning about their material culture, their cosmology, and their traditions.
And welcome back to Coast, the Cygnus Key. Andrew Collins is a writer, historian living in the United Kingdom. He's the author of more than a dozen books that challenge the way we perceive the past. In 2008, Andrew and a colleague, Nigel Skinner Simpson, discovered a previously unrecorded cave complex behind and beneath the pyramids of Giza, which has brought him worldwide acclaim. And, of course, his latest work is called The Cygnus Key, The Denisovan Legacy, Gobekli Tepe, and the Birth of Egypt. Andrew, welcome back, my friend.
Hi, George. Yes, it's just about 8 o'clock in the morning here, but I'm bright and well and ready for a good interview here.
And I'm on the West Coast, so it's 12:11 a.m. right now. And
right.
Here we go. The subtitle of the book is called The Denisovan Legacy. Yeah. What are they? What is that?
We're talking about a completely previously unknown group of pre-humans, basically. The anthropologists call them hominins, basically, as part of the human group, but prior to us modern Homo sapiens, or modern humans as we call it. And we had no knowledge of their existence until 2010, when a finger bone that was found in a cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia was examined, and the genome of it, the DNA, was found to actually come from this absolutely unknown human species. And what's so important about this is not only has other fossil remains been found of this particular species, who is today known as the Denisovans, after the cave that they were discovered called the Denisova Cave, but it would also seem that they had incredible technology and possibly even a very developed understanding of the heavens, the celestial bodies, eclipse cycles, and that they may well have passed on this legacy to the earliest modern humans that passed through this region, southern Siberia, Mongolia, prior to around 40,000 years ago, when the Denisovans disappeared from history. And this technology is absolutely quite extraordinary. They created jewelry that was so beautiful that it's not seen again for at least another 20,000, 30,000 years.
Wow.
They had bone needles, the first ever in the world, suggesting that they wore tailored clothing. They may well have ridden horses. They created the first musical instruments. And all the evidence that I'm putting together would seem to suggest that they were absolutely fascinated by the celestial bodies and the time cycles associated with them, and recorded these down on things like bone plates and things like that, and that this information contained the most extraordinary number sequences, numbers like 54, 108, 216, 432, which crop up in much later times within cosmological myths and legends, and also within sacred architecture, all the way around the world, from Mesopotamia to India to Cambodia, Java, China, even in northern Europe, to do with cosmic time cycles. And you have to ask yourself, if this is the case, then who were these Denisovans? You know, what more can we find out about them, and what exactly was their impact on the beginning of our own civilization?
What did they look like, Andrew?
Well, everything tends to suggest from the fossil remains that we have that they were extremely large in size and possibly in height as well. And it is very likely that they are remembered in legend as giants. And in the very area where the evidence of their existence has been found, which is, as I said, in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia and Mongolia, there are legends to do with this population of giants who handed to humanity not just their own ancestry, in other words, they were the founders of clans and tribes, but also that they taught us how to create bridges, irrigation ditches, the first musical instruments, the first stone monuments. And I think there's a strong possibility that this is actually a memory of the Denisovans and their immediate hybrid descendants, because there is also a lot of evidence that we actually interbred with the Denisovans when our earliest ancestors passed through this region, going gradually eastwards towards the eastern and southeastern part of Asia, and that this ancestry is something that's crucial to us understanding exactly who we were and where civilization came from.
Could you call them giants, Andrew?
I would, yes. I mean, I think it's a little bit like, when somebody, catches a fish and you say what size it was and
it gets bigger.
Gradually extend.
Yeah.
But, I think that the folklore, myths and legends would suggest that they were a lot taller than what they actually are. But I think we're probably looking at individuals that were, if you could imagine, the biggest wrestlers that fight for the WWE. That's the type of size that the Denisovans were. Now, I'm not saying that every single one of their community was like that, but it does seem as if at least some individuals as part of this population actually looked like this.
Were they the Nephilim of the biblical days?
I think that there is a possibility, yes, that some of the traditions to do with the Watchers, the Nephilim, the Anunnaki, that talk about them being of extreme size is a distant memory of the Denisovans and their hybrid descendants, because even after the Denisovans disappear from prehistory around 40,000 years ago, you'd have still had their hybrid descendants, and they would have carried their physical appearance, their mindset, and also their legacy quite clearly. This is very, very important. I mean, I mentioned the word mindset here because it does also appear that the Denisovans had a very unique mindset, because when the genome was sequenced of the Denisovans in 2010, which was how we first discovered that they existed as an independent population, what it was found is that they had certain genes that relate very specifically to autism in modern populations. And now this doesn't necessarily mean that the Denisovans were autistic, but it does suggest that they had a mindset that could have thought in a manner which modern autistic people on the autistic spectrum may well have, thought in a similar way. And what I mean by that is these time cycles, the monitoring of the sun, the moon and the stars, and long-term eclipse cycles, and generating these cosmic numbers and projecting them forward to create numbers which were thousands, even millions of digits, not digits, but in length, millions of numbers in length, could well have come from a savant-like mindset, a autistic-like mindset. And it may well be that they are the source of these cosmic time cycles, and that they passed them on to our earliest ancestors and said to them, just never forget these. These are very important. You can use these. And that we've remembered them and we've put them into sacred architecture. They're contained within our cosmological myths and legends. And they appear all around the world, the same numbers, 432, 216, 108, 54. They're there everywhere. And, I mean, people like my colleague Graham Hancock and others have tried to find the source of these numbers, suggesting that they belonged to a lost civilization. And I think that we may just have found that lost civilization.
Might they have been extraterrestrials?
I don't think that they were extraterrestrials. I think that they were born and bred on Earth, and they had several 100,000 years to develop the mindset and physiology that they actually had, which was obviously a lot longer than our own ancestors, because, I mean, the earliest modern humans, in theory, only go back about to around 300,000 years ago. But the Denisovans had been around for several 100,000 years, before they disappeared. And that's a long time to develop your own, your own mindset, physiology. And I think that this is one of the reasons why they became so technologically advanced. But of course, the big question now is what impact did they have elsewhere in the world? We know that they were in Siberia, almost certainly Mongolia, but where else were they? I mean, the modern populations that still carry Denisovan DNA or Denisovan ancestry can be found in many different places of the world, everywhere from China to Southeast Asia, to Melanesia, to Australia, all the furthest reaches where our earliest ancestors reached probably as much as 40 to 50,000 years ago. And we're in its infancy at the moment. The understanding of the Denisovans is something which we're all trying to get to grips with. I mean, my colleague Graham Hancock, for instance, he went out to the Denisova cave where these bones were found last October. He's into it. It will appear in his books when they come out next. And I know some of my other colleagues are working on this. And the archaeologists realise how important they are as well. They realise that some of the earliest inventions of our ancestors, particularly in the area of Siberia, may well have come from our contact with the Denisovans. And therefore, this is not just a fringe idea. This is something that's going to grow and grow and grow as the years go by.
Now, what's the tie-in with the constellation Cygnus, of course? It's in the northern sky. It means swan in Latin. It's associated with the mythology of Zeus in the Greek mythology. But, it's the title of your book, The Cygnus Key. Tell me the tie-in.
Well, all the way around the world, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, people of the past focused their attention on the stars of the northern sky. This was where the stars revolve around what's known as the northern celestial pole. And in the same vicinity is the Milky Way. And where the Milky Way splits in two is the constellation of Cygnus. Cygnus means swan, but the constellation of Cygnus is also known as the Northern Cross. And it was also seen in many different cultures around the world as a cosmic bird, whether it be a swan, a goose, an eagle, a hawk. In the Near East and Turkey, it was seen as a vulture. And always, this is a cosmic bird of creation. It's also a place where life was seen to exist prior to incarnation. And at the point of death, we would return to this same place in the sky. Now, there are many different reasons why Cygnus would have become important, but what's important more than that is the fact that these ideas would seem to go back to the very time of the Denisovans and the Denisovan hybrid, because all of these ideas would seem to have come out of Siberia, and where all of these ideas would seem to have been part of a very early form of shamanism that was associated with these cosmic time cycles, and that the connection between this cosmic bird, particularly the swan, and time cycles is something that's remembered all the way around the world, particularly, for instance, in India. Within the Vedic tradition, the swan was seen not just to be this bird of creation, but also it regulated cosmic time on behalf of the creator god Brahma. Now, I think there's a possibility that these ideas came originally from the north, from the area of the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, and that they migrated southwards into India, where you find a lot of Denisovan DNA and ancestry, even to this day.
And Andrew, these people, how big do you think the population was?
Well, it's a difficult one because the only absolute fossil remains that we have at the moment come from the area of southern Siberia. But we know that from the DNA in modern populations that they were everywhere in the eastern part of the Eurasian landmass. And this is where we find their descendants today. So we have to assume the possibility that the Denisovans were also in many other parts of the world as well. And also there is a possibility that they were in Europe, and almost certainly in North America and in South America, where you also find Denisovan DNA within indigenous peoples even to this day.
Did they build the pyramids of Giza or assist?
I don't think that they built them, but this is the interesting part about the legacy, because the Denisovan legacy would seem to be that they passed on ideas in technology and spirituality and time cycles that eventually were carried to places like Gobekli Tepe in southeast Turkey, which is these incredible stone enclosures that are built on a mountain there with these beautiful T-shaped pillars with these carvings of animals and birds and human forms. And it would seem as if these ideas actually ended up there. And we can tell this because there is literally a footprint that goes from southern Siberia through the Ural Mountains, where you find evidence of high culture there as early as 15, 20,000 years ago, all the way down through the Russian steppes and the Caucasus into the area of what is today Turkey, where, of course, around 11,500 years ago, just after the end of the last ice age, civilization begins with places like Gobekli Tepe. It seems as if there are direct links to places like Gobekli Tepe, and that footprint then continues southwards through the Levant into Egypt, into the Nile Valley, where it would seem to have inspired the creation of early settlements in the area of the Giza Plateau, and that these ideas remained there, and that eventually they flowered into the Pyramid Age and the creation of the Great Pyramid around 2600 BC. What's interesting is that we find at both Gobekli Tepe and on the Giza Plateau with the three main pyramids is that they are all aligned to the bright stars of the constellation of Cygnus. And this seems to be very, very important because it would seem that the cultures that created Gobekli Tepe and the Great Pyramids of Egypt all saw this same area of the sky as the place of cosmic creation, the place where life came from before incarnation and would return to in death.
Now, this sect of people, the Denisovans, they were advanced, but how advanced technologically? I mean, did they have flying machines, the Vermanas, for example?
Not that we're aware of yet, but if any of your listeners want to look up the Denisovan bracelet, just put that in the search engines and just have a look at a picture of it. It's this beautiful item of jewellery, like a bangle, made of this green stone known as chlorite. And it's a very particular type of mineral. It changes colour in natural and in artificial light. But what's so interesting about it is that not only is it beautifully crafted and finished and polished, but it has a hole bored through it that when the archaeologists examined it under a microscope, they saw that it had a feed rate which suggested that the drill that was used to make this hole was an incredibly fast drill, almost of like the same speed as you would attain with a modern drill.
Andrew, when you heard about this discovery, I mean, did you go wild? What happened?
Well, it happened several years ago because I've been trying to look for the origins of civilization. My books have taken me from the pyramids of Giza and the discovery of the cave complex there to Gobekli Tepe and trying to understand, who might have created this and for what purpose. And you start looking for the origins and you realize that those origins are not in the Near East or the Middle East, that you're looking for somewhere else. And I gradually found myself moving further and further north and east until we eventually end up in the Ural Mountains of Russia, where, as I said, there is evidence of high culture there, painted caves and some incredible stuff, going back 15, 20,000 years. But even that's not the start point, because it would seem as if you go further east, that's where you find the beginnings of high culture. And this is exactly where the Denisovan evidence has been found. And once I realised this, I thought this is just too coincidental. It's quite clearly that this ancient hominin population must have been responsible for at least gifting civilization to humanity. And then with the archaeologists finding so much evidence of extreme high culture with these people, I just thought, this is the answer, this has to be. Now, obviously there are alternatives as to, where our own civilization comes from. In the ancient mysteries subject, people have suggested that perhaps it was the survivors of Atlantis. After the continent sank, that the survivors came to the old world or the new world and started anew and created civilizations there. Others might like to believe that ancient aliens were responsible for civilization. Now, this is all fine, but we now have another alternative. And that alternative is the fact that one of our predecessors, the Denisovans, may well have had extreme high culture before we ourselves developed civilization, and that civilization was gifted to us by these distant cousins of us.
Are these Denisovans still around, or are they all gone?
They're all gone as far as, the actual Denisovans themselves, but they interbred with our own ancestors, and that ancestry, as the anthropologists like to refer to it, or the geneticists, is still with us. Because you'll find that there are modern populations from China, from Australia, India, and in many other parts of the world that still carry Denisovan DNA today. And I think that by looking at the cultures and the civilizations in the areas where this ancestry can be found today could give us clues. It could allow us to understand how far-reaching the legacy of the Denisovans actually was. But here's an interesting fact. There is no Denisovan DNA west of Central Asia. There's none in Europe whatsoever. There's none in Africa. Excuse me. And the reason for this is that most of the people that came out of Africa travelled eastwards, and they encountered the Denisovans as they entered into Central Asia, and probably around 40 to 50,000 years ago. And obviously, once they'd interbred with them, their ancestors continued that journey eastwards to the furthest reaches of the Eurasian continent, and of course, even beyond that, into the Americas, whether they went via Siberia and Alaska, or whether they went across the Atlantic via places like Australia, New Zealand, Antarctica, into South America, using boats. This seems to be a possibility. And I think that the origins of civilization in the Americas is the next place to look for the clues of what exactly happened to the Denisovans, because here we find evidence of giant skeletons being found in Native American First People mounds all over the United States. Thousands and thousands of skeletons have been found. Unfortunately, they're all now disappeared, and it's something which I think has a connection with the Denisovans. It may well be that these giants that were in control of many of the Native American tribes, that would seem to have been the case. They were elites, they were the shamans, would seem to almost certainly to be hybrid descendants of the Denisovans.
Were they peaceful people or warring, in your opinion?
We don't know enough about them yet, but we found no evidence to suggest that they were warlike. I suggest that from their very long period of development, over several 100,000 years, that they'd become extremely wise people. And I think that they probably existed more in isolation than in anything else. They probably lived away from any of the other types of hominin that existed, let's say 40 to 50,000 years ago, which of course was not just our own ancestors, so-called modern humans or Homo sapiens, but also Neanderthals, remember. There were Neanderthals in Central Asia, in Siberia, and there was another type of hominin there, which we don't even know what they look like. We only have DNA evidence of them. We call them species X. And they could be Homo erectus, they could be another type of early, human group that we have no knowledge of. So there were various different types of people, some of them very tall, some of them probably, like the hobbits of the island of Flores in Indonesia, very small, and some obviously in between. It would almost have been like something out of Lord of the Rings. The Middle Earth of J.R.R. Tolkien at this time. But certainly it would seem that the Denisovans were the tallest of all of the groups.
What was their role with the Gobekli Tepe in Turkey?
Well, it's more the legacy, because the Denisovans disappear from the scene around 40,000 years ago.
And but just for people who don't know what it is, it was a temple complex, right?
Yeah, I mean, Gobekli Tepe, if you can imagine Stonehenge, multiply it by about 20 times, put it on the top of this mountain in southeast Turkey, carve beautiful images of animals and birds on the stones, which have these T-shaped capitals. This is what Gobekli Tepe is. It has only been known about over the last 20 years. It was discovered in the mid-1990s by a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, who's no longer with us. And he initiated excavations on behalf of the German Archaeological Institute. And they've uncovered the most extraordinary carved art, not just in the stone pillars that they've excavated, but also in mobile art, in jewellery. And in many ways, there are a lot of similarities with what they found, certainly as far as the mobile art at Gobekli Tepe, and what you have in connection with the Denisovans and their hybrid descendants in Siberia, which is one of the reasons that drew my attention towards the area of Siberia in the first place. And by the way, the area of Siberia that we're talking about it's in Russia itself, right on the edge, very close to the border with China, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan. This is marked geographically by the Altai Mountains that stretch for many hundreds of miles. And this is an area which is rich with archaeology from around 40 to 60,000 years ago. And much of this, it would seem, is associated with the Denisovans. And remember, we didn't even know they existed before 2010. But of course, it's very much like the dinosaurs. I mean, dinosaur bones were around long before it was realised that this whole class of huge lizards that we now know as dinosaurs existed in the Jurassic period and the Cretaceous period. But of course, we didn't have the answers as to why these bones existed. And it's the same with the Denisovans today. Now we're aware of their existence, everything can start being put together. The pieces of the jigsaw can start to be looked at. Evidence of high culture that's been found around the world, which we've attributed maybe to ancient aliens or Atlantis or whatever, could actually be evidence of the existence of the Denisovans and their far-reaching legacy that was carried through into modern civilization.
It's amazing work, Andrew, and the fact that they were around how many years ago? 40-some thousand, or even further back?
The Denisovan bracelet that I talked about was manufactured 60 to 70,000 years ago.
60 to 70.
Is absolutely extraordinary. There was nothing else manufactured like this until the early Neolithic period, around 10,000 years ago. Nothing at all. And that's what makes it so remarkable. And this is not in dispute. The archaeologists who are mostly Russian that are working on this, out in Siberia, are not in any doubt about the fact that it was the Denisovans that created this jewelry and not our own ancestors.
Where did they get the incredible technology that they apparently had?
They must have learnt it over a period of time, but remember what I said about this mindset, this special mindset that they had. This seems to have been savant-like. That's the term that we use today for the autistic qualities, people that are on the autistic spectrum. There was a necessity for detail, one which we can understand from the autistic mindset, that to create perfection, to go beyond a lifestyle of simply survival and conquering and rationalization, that it would seem as if their mindset was much more pure, much more spiritual, and that they found beauty important. And I think this is why they would have created things like this. But there's plenty more as well, which we're only beginning to uncover, because the legends to do with the giants of the Altai Mountains talk about them creating the first stone monuments, the first megalithic monuments. And although we cannot prove that at the moment, there are a number of possible super megaliths that have been discovered in the area of Siberia that people have said are part of a lost civilization. And I've looked at the photographs of these. I'm actually going to Siberia next year to examine a lot of this evidence. And there is some definite evidence that something was going on. People were moving around extremely large blocks at a very early stage. And it doesn't seem to have been something that was done during the Neolithic period. It may well be that this predates the Neolithic by tens of thousands of years. And as I said, I know that a number of my colleagues are also onto this and are also looking in this direction for answers at the moment.
But they had this technology, and they were able to use it and do some incredible things. Why do you think, in essence, they disappeared? What happened to them?
Well, I think it can be no coincidence that they disappear around the same time that our own modern ancestors enter the same area. It may well be that we killed them off. It was not something that may have happened overnight, probably over maybe a few thousand years, maybe even 10,000 years, but it would seem to have happened. The same thing, of course, occurred in Europe with the Neanderthals. The Neanderthal people, who were much more advanced than we've really been told, existed and thrived across the Eurasian continent, particularly in Europe, for anything up to around 300,000 years. And then they disappear within 10 to 15,000 years of our own ancestors entering into Europe. There's very clearly, an overlap here that suggests that, there was conflict. And I think the same thing happened with the Denisovans as well.
And what do you think the significance is of this group of people?
Well, I think that we have here the key to understanding not only the origins of cosmology to do with the Cygnus constellation and our understanding of the stars, but also these people projected forward in time. I think that the reason why they were creating these long-term time cycles, these cosmic cycles with all these incredible numbers, is that they believed that it was important to somehow control time or understand or lock in to time itself. And the only reason you can be doing that is that you are looking towards future eschatonic points.
Those of you who already know, Stephen Quayle is not just an author. He's been investigating and discussing worst-case scenarios approaching this world and how Stephen Quayle believes they interrelate to each other. So earthquakes and volcanoes and nuclear and biological terrorism, plus any number of different economic circumstances and the potential disaster that awaits us all by with these genetic manipulations and their frequency, their coming frequency in what Stephen Quayle sees as how this all relates back to fallen angels and giants. And after reading these books, I can just tell you there's only one word that kept coming to mind is, this is pretty trippy stuff. There's so many different ways this conversation can go. I have no idea where it will end. I just know how I'll get started with a simple hello for Stephen Quayle, and thanks for giving us some time tonight.
Well, hello, Ian. Nice to be with you, and good morning, everyone.
Yeah, and you have so many fans out there. Let me start by making the same assertion I end up making week after week on Coast to Coast. I am the dumbest guy I know, so let me just say thank you right away for putting lots of photos in your book, because that helps me understand things a little better. I find myself, as a skeptic, I am more easily persuaded when I can see photos of things, and there are lots of really good illustrations about what you're talking about. And I think your points are so heady that had you not put those in there, I don't think I would have been able to follow you. But I am so into what you have written because I think you make a cohesive argument, and I'm dying to explore it.
Well, thank you, Ian. You know, the subject of giants is kind of in the same category as dinosaurs from the standpoint everybody is familiar with them, from the children's stories of the ogres, Jack and the Beanstalk, Jack the Giant Killer. All of the mythologies of the world all go back to the time of giants. The incredibly oversized or non-human-sized monuments and sacred sites around the world. And fascinatingly enough, as I've tracked all the different statements from oral history, oral tradition, written records, stelae, hieroglyphics, you name it, the subject of giants can't be escaped or can't be gotten away from. Especially when, one picture is worth 1,000 words. Now, for the first time ever, the picture that we put up on our website to kind of hallmark your show tonight, the picture of the tomb of the giant. By the way, that's not me. I'm 54, so that picture was taken after World War II in Egypt.
Oh, good. I'm glad you told me that.
Yeah, and my webmaster didn't put the right heading on it, so you guys took it off my picture. But that's one of the coast-to-coast listeners whose father was actually in Egypt. He's holding a turban that is brass-lined, and he literally was allowed to see, because of his access to the military in those days, he was allowed to see the giant, the 10-foot skeleton. Now, in my book, I basically go over, as you know, I take the entire world and break it down by the records of not only the world's most famous historians, Strabo, Josephus, everybody who's anybody, Berosus the Persian, Herodotus, everybody has mentioned the giants, and it's my contention that all mythology is based on the real fact that there were these individuals who were phenomenally strong, supernaturally brilliant, and absolutely were not mankind's friends, and they were ultimately destroyed, or they would have destroyed mankind.
Well, and this is the part that I also think stands in contrast to how you had originally talked about giants in the introduction there, that, we hear about Jack and the Beanstalk, but while he was a physical giant, he was obviously not a mental giant. And I think that's part of that image that we have of giants, is that the bigger they are, the dumber they fall. And that we are often, that's kind of how we prove ourselves as giant killers, is we use our intellect to compensate for our lack of size. So when you talk about them being super smart, I think that part is sort of a curve in the story that we don't expect.
Well, and I think that's a good point. One of the most... are you there?
I am.
I'm sorry, someone cut out.
Oh,
one of the most amazing stories is King Og, O-G, who is one of the guys that's in very well detailed in the Old Testament. And he basically was 18 feet tall. And in Deuteronomy chapter 3, it talks about King Og, but he was known for his brilliance because he was the last of the giants to be able to resist the attacks upon the giants. Then when you get to the Germanic giants, the Cimbrians and others, I mean, good night, these giants were able to wipe out until a certain point. They were able to wipe out all of Caesar's crack Roman soldiers. So we're not talking about just a bunch of, unshaven, just big guys with a lot of strength. We're talking about some very wise men, especially when it came to battlefield tactics.
Well, and that is its own kind of brilliance. But I mean, this notion of them being intellectually superior as well as physically intimidating. That part is new for me in the giant lore. But let's start at the beginning. For those people that don't know, give an overview, if you would, on how you believe giants came to Earth and how long they lasted on the Earth as a group, which could be reasonably called the giants, as opposed to just tall people amongst us.
Well, first of all, going back to Genesis, it states there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God, meaning the angels, came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became the mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And it doesn't matter what myth, what historic structure you put it in, you always have this idea of angels, or as some people, as you're aware, believe the spacemen came to Earth and had sex with Earth women, producing a genetic hybrid. I don't believe that, but I believe specifically that we've got the history books complete, the mythological records complete, with the idea that there were a group of guys, and they were guys that came to Earth, had sexual relations with the Earth women, and produced these supernatural men, which the Bible says that became the mighty men of renown.
Now, other than the biblical record of Genesis 6 on this story, why not females, giants, coming to Earth?
Well, first of all, the interesting, that's a good question. In all, and I want to share this with you, whether it's Greek mythology, Babylonian mythology, any of the ancient Egyptian mythology, it's always in the masculine sense. Now, there were giantesses produced out of that union. I mean, obviously, depending on, the sex of the child giant, you would have giantesses, and there's a whole bunch of fascinating women in history who fulfilled that role. And I'm talking big ladies. I'm talking 12-footers.
Right.
So the point is that, but it's an anomaly that they're always spoken of in the context of males, and that's one of the most striking anomalies that, as I've researched this, that pops right out into the common focus.
Well, I'll just throw something out at you, and you just respond to it as you want, but just remember, too, that in Hebrew, the collective of anything would probably be in the male, not female or neuter form. So even if you're talking about, like, as we say, mankind, we don't just mean men, we mean humankind.
Right.
And so I just wonder where in their story, because, if we get too gender specific with that language, it might mean that there were no female giants. But it seems to me somehow, in order for these giants to continue to create more giants, is that there have to be these giantesses in there somewhere in order to keep them big. Or if they kept reproducing with normal human-sized women, at the time would have been 4 to 5 feet tall, it would just dramatically decrease the likelihood that there would ever be any more giants after a few generations.
Well, yeah, but that's absolutely not accurate from the standpoint that even going beyond the linguistic uniqueness of Hebrew, you're finding it in, let's just say, Babylonian, the Akkadian language, too, especially when you're talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Right.
Now, for a lot of years, and for those of you that don't know, and this is on my website, so you can go and read it, it's fascinating, but Gilgamesh was believed to be a fictional character by, quote, the mainstream archaeologists, anthropologists, those who questioned everything was myth to them. But a few years ago, the actual tomb of Gilgamesh was found and basically said, I'll paraphrase it, here lies Gilgamesh, 2/3 God, 1/3 man. And on the engraving, actually the stele, the inscribed rock image, you have a gentleman that is somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 12 feet, seated, holding a lion by its rear feet. And next to it, you have one of the interesting guys that's in history called the Lion Man of Moab. And so you've got a contemporary archaeological find bearing witness and solidifying and validating the fact that what mainstream archaeologists said was only fiction, and Epic of Gilgamesh is 4,500 years old, is very, very now prominent, and I find it unique and truly fascinating that the main story, the oldest poetic narrative now, the validation has come through modern archaeology.
Well, so just then, so we wrap up the timeline as you present it, the fallen ones come and they procreate with earth women, and this line of giants continues for how long?
Well, it continued both through the fall and after. It continued through Noah's flood and after, because again, Genesis says there were giants in those days, both before and after. And now the interesting thing that you have is you actually have tales of giants, and I'm talking living giants, in everything from the Solomon Island to different parts of the world. And again, modern man has a hard time finding it. But for those that don't know what we're talking about, that are on the internet, they can go to the link we put up for Coast to Coast and click on it. You can see the Kashmir giants on the front of my book. One of them's 9 feet tall, one of them's 10 feet tall at the turn of the century. That was 1905 when the British 6-foot explorer was taken with those pictures, Ian.
Well, and that's fascinating, and I love that photo. And again, thanks for including that kind of work, because it really helps bring it home for me. But explain, though, when did giants stop being a nation of giants? When was the, if you'll pardon the term, the diaspora of giants? When did they stop being some sort of cohesive nationality, if you will, that had that reigned together or worked and survived in a group?
Well, probably the most contemporary group, when we're talking group, hundreds of giants, we're probably talking the Solomon Island giants, because when the Japanese landed at Guadalcanal, even the Japanese historians, now we're talking obviously World War II, were basically the advanced party that landed on one side of the island was decimated, and they were literally destroyed by the giants. Now, people still can't grasp that we're talking about these individuals. The question that will come up, obviously, in the show is, where are they if they're real, and why aren't they presented to the public? I have an answer for that, but we'll get to that a little later.
Okay, well...
But to answer your question...
Yeah, because you're killing me on that. I'm so dying to know the answer to that. But go ahead. No, finish up.
But all of the great explorers, from De Soto, Magellan, Captain Cook, all the circumnavigators of the world, all encountered giants. And so when you're talking about Cortez and the chronicles of his that were taken both in in Mexico, and those who went into South America, you have contemporary writings of groups of giants. For instance, the Patagonians up until the 1850s, 1890s. Patagonia, by the way, the word means big feet. I actually have on my website a documentation of the Gentleman's Gazette, I think written in about 1767, that goes into great detail on Magellan's encounter of the Patagonian giants.
All right. So, just so if I can understand this, we believe that the giants were formed by fallen angels that come to a particular area in the Bible during a period of time. And then do they spread out from there almost immediately, or is there a central event that you believe in the timeline of giants which then sends them spreading out all over the world? Or did these fallen angels, as you described them, come down simultaneously to various places around the earth? Well,
they first descended on Mount Hermon, which is in the Middle East. But then there was a diaspora, or a dispersion of them, because, again, when they encountered the Israelites, God gave the command to Joshua and Caleb to go into the Promised Land, and that's when the famous statement, when Joshua and Caleb go into the Promised Land to spy it out, they said, we were as grasshoppers in their sight, and so we were in ours. And they talked about the land being a terrible land because it devoured its inhabitants. One of the unusual things about the giants, that no matter where you encounter them worldwide, they're always cannibalistic. And it's fascinating because, again, it doesn't matter if it's Caesar dealing with the German giants, or Caesar dealing with the Gaelic giants, or the British giants. The issue is they're always dealing with some pretty nasty characters. And by the way, this was the basis of Hitler's wanting to build the Aryan race, rebuild it, was based on the Teutonic giants,
right.
The Cimbrians. And what most people don't understand, these guys were 12 to 14 feet tall, as recorded by the different Caesars that had to fight them. And I mean, we're talking about some amazing battles. For instance, one of the words that enters into common usage that most people don't realize comes from the giants. It's cutting someone down to size. That came from the infamous battles of the Roman soldiers against the German giants. By the way, this is all cataloged in my book, and I've got enough footnotes to make anybody sink under the weight of them.
You do. You have
but
a bunch.
I've got thousands of footnotes. So the interesting thing is that the average Roman fighting soldier came up to the kneecaps of some of these giants.
Get out. I mean,
and what's amazing is that there were times when, with the exception of 2 or 3 men, the giants totally wiped out all of Caesar's army, and until a really amazing guy by the name of Marius, a 25-year-old general, figured out how to basically build lion traps and lure the giants in. But what was fascinating, they had blonde hair down to their waist. They were incredibly tall, and they wore their hair kind of in spikes. Some of them wore it in spikes. Some wore fancy clothes. Some wore no clothes. But the point is that the sound of their nasal pharyngeal scream was unearthly. And again, we'll get to this a little later on in the show, but it's very much like in recorded history. It's like what contemporary people around the world have encountered when they've encountered the Yeti, the abominable snowman, the Yowie. You know, they're known by different names all around the world. But the sound of these things was amazing, and that's what basically disheartened initially the Roman soldiers. Also, the word berserk. You know, we always talk about someone going berserk.
And I know that berserkers were a particular type of warrior. Are you saying they were giants?
Absolutely. And that's where we get that word, because they were so crazy. They were so like anything that the Roman legions had ever encountered, and that's where we get the word. So getting back to Hitler sent out a crack group of SS agents called the Ahnenerbe, and they were looking for all of the artifacts, and we'll get to that too, but specifically they were looking for the giants, the golden sarcophaguses, and they went all over the world looking for those individuals.
Well, putting aside Hitler for the moment, I do want to ask about what genetic DNA coding might still be in some of us. That whether you know it, I know you've done a lot of work with genetics and you're very interested in that, and I want to find out whether there's anything in there that you've been able to find out about who might be or what nation might be more inclined to have giants.
You know, whether people like to admit it or not, the idea of finding the strength of these individuals, and not to mention their intelligence, is another thing. You know, they weren't all ogres. They weren't all fee-fi-fo-fum. I smell the blood of an Englishman, okay? But the point being is that some of the people in history who were literally larger than life by reputation was because they were truly larger than everybody else around them. So can I give you an example of a girl that's being sought because they want the DNA of these individuals? They want it really bad. In the Ukraine, there's a little girl named Varia Akulova. And this little girl weighs 40 kilos. It's about, 88 pounds. She is in the Guinness Book of World Records as being the strongest girl in the world. She can lift 800 pounds. Now, you're going to say, whoa, how can that be? And if anybody wants to go see that article, it's on my website. It's called The World's Strongest Girl. I have a search engine. And by the way, when you spend 30 years at this with the skepticism and the ridicule, I can back up what I say.
Well, that's so much to your credit that you take the time to do that. So as a skeptic, let me say thank you, because it makes it so much, it really puts flesh on the bones on this for me.
Right. Well, they've identified a gene in this little girl of Varia, and they've actually called it the Hercules gene, okay? Now, we know, obviously, Samson was an amazing guy in the Bible in the Old Testament times, because he was a literal figure. Some people doubt that, but there's too many records, and I don't want to argue that. But you're talking about a supernatural strength. I mean, 800 pounds for an 88-pound little girl is pretty striking. I mean, you know, you go to Gold's Gym and you watch the biggest guys with the biggest muscles, and I can tell you this, none of them I know can do that. And so they've identified the gene, the Hercules gene. Concurrent with the Hercules gene, they're looking for the longevity gene called the Methuselah gene, okay?
Right.
Because King Og of Bashan lived to be 500 years old. That's something that most people don't know. And whether they want to believe in longevity before the flood and after the flood, that can be argued. But again, they're looking for the genetic material to basically reanimate and bring these guys back. And again, most people say, oh, that's just ridiculous. When you've got British Museum, when you've got the U.S. military, when you've got the Russian military, when you've got the Chinese military, and everybody's on, believe it or not, the biggest giant hunt in history, there's something to this. And this isn't science fiction. This isn't supposition. This isn't, just throwing it out there to make people interested. This is really going on. And so when you get into the genetic makeup of these giants, the point that most people lose track of is that given some of the pharaohs, remember, the pharaohs were seen as gods, and when we see Hollywood's presentation of the pharaohs, it's not at all like some of the, especially the older kingdom. The older kingdom always represents the pharaohs as truly larger than most pharaohs, and they always have a predisposition towards an incredibly active sexual appetite. You asked me about that, and that's where, we'll go there whenever you want to go there, because, again, the thing that's amazing when you understand the giants is that they were dispersed throughout the world, and it's my contention that you're seeing now the ancient civilizations that are coming up literally out of the ashes of history. Let me give you a good example. London was called, and most people don't know this, before it became London, England, it was called New Troy, because there's history in London, that Brutus, a Trojan, settled that and had to fight the two British giants who happened to be called Gog and Magog. And for those who think this is far-fetched, I also have the link on my site that every November, London celebrates with the giant caricatures of these two interesting individuals that were 18 feet tall, and they were literally chained to the city gates as a war trophy. I'm talking live ones, and I'm talking, obviously, 1,000 years ago. But the point being is that when you've got Gog and Magog being the descendants of Og lived 500 years. He was the last of the Rephaim, the last of the Anakim. He was the guy that the DNA is being sought for. So I can tell you this, I was told by people in the know that the most important find or the related find to the tomb of Gilgamesh, 2/3 God was 1/3 man, was they wanted his DNA. They wanted it really badly. And they, meaning the people that go bump in the night.
Okay. So just to recap then, the story of the Solomon Islands giants is something which is better known regionally, including going so far as to have a statue in honor of this event, than it is internationally. But that there are some records then of this. Now, what happened to that? Are those people still there? Can they be found?
Well, they can be found, and the Guadalcanalese are interesting because, Guadalcanal has a lot of underground, like lava tubes. It has a lot of underground facilities. Marius, the guy that I spoke to, a fascinating story there, just real quickly. Marius wanted to basically go and film some of the live giants, and wouldn't you know it, I won't go on record, but a certain intelligence agency did everything they could to try and literally keep him from going there, to the point of threatening his life. His wife, he's married to, by the way, a Guadalcanalese. And the Guadalcanalese literally talk about, right now in the Solomon Islands, especially in Guadalcanal, there's a lot of mining exploration going on, and there's literally an account that Marius relates that was related to him by one of his wife's relatives in the last several years, of a D5 tractor blade, that was taken off the tractor to be repaired, and it literally being thrown. So, thrown by a living giant. The thing was found, so many yards away. And by the way, this whole story's on my website under, on your Coast to Coast link, okay?
Right.
And I want people to go there and read it. And, Ian, you would be interested because, again, with your understanding of World War II, it's got a lot of the beaches that we landed on, the Japanese landed on, and Marius has identified everything. So it's pretty easy to follow the whole treatise. And I don't know if you've had a chance to read that yet on your site link.
No, I haven't, but I will. I mean, I was just looking at something today on that on the History Channel. Very interesting. Well, why then are giants so shy? Because if we had to look at the history of giants as you present them, these giants were dominating figures. and they created awe and respect, not just because of their physical presence, although that was intimidating and part of it, but also because of their mental abilities. And they appeared to be leaders in various cultures all around the world. So when did they start to become reluctant to be leaders, and why did they start shrinking away from the spotlight?
Well, I think shrinking away is maybe not, not accurate, because basically when they were sought out and found out, they were killed, okay? Because, again, there's something almost problematic with being larger than life, is that, you not only do you stand head and shoulders above the rest, but, when you've got that kind of power, let's just go to a couple of famous ones that most people are unaware of. Charlemagne was a giant. St. Christopher was a giant. King Arthur, the legends surrounding Arthur are amazing, but Sir Gawain, his grave was 14 feet long. You deal with Merlin. You deal with all these characters from history that think, oh, these are just made-up stories, blah, blah, blah. But then they find actual archaeological evidence dealing with these guys, and they truly are larger than life. One of the most interesting guys was one of the Caesars of Rome. His name was Maximinius. And Maximinius was able to outrun chariots. Now, that takes some pretty major leg power. And what you've got is, again, understand this, that whether people have ever seen the movie Universal Soldier with Jean-Claude Van Damme or not, the idea of the perfect soldier, one that doesn't need sleep, one that has, amplified or multiplied strength, wisdom, and the abilities of these guys, the giants, are amazing. For instance, when you're dealing with the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayas, you're always dealing with their myths of origin or their historical accounts of origin of the giants from the east coming with blonde hair building their cities. As you deal with the fabulous book that Graham Hancock wrote called Underworld, dealing with the sunken civilizations that basically met a cataclysmic end, like the pyramid structure off of Yonguni off the coast of Okinawa, you're dealing with massive structures. And it's my contention that all pyramids and that all of the massive temple structures that are lined up with their celestial coordinates, whether it's Orion or whatever specific constellation happens to be, there is no human basis of that knowledge, just like the Dogon tribe of Timbuktu. Timbuktu is a real place, and the point is how do natives that run around pretty much half naked and have such incredible astronomical intelligence? This has been the question of the cave drawings in Altamira, Spain, or Lascaux, France. These are not just pictures of buffalo. These are some of the most amazing constellation and star charts. So I maintain that history, as you and I have been taught it, is phony. I believe that there is an answer to the megastructures that are around the world, and that mythology basically all relates back to the giants, and it gets back to fallen angels having sex with earth women. The actual accounts of St. Christopher do not match the Catholic Church's, view of him, but I can tell you that there really was a guy named St. Christopher, and he was a giant. I go into that in my book, and I footnote all the background for people that want to know that.
But again, see, part of what you end up doing, it's a very interesting turn on that, though, is it ends up going back to that point of why did giants stop being leaders? When's the turn when giants start falling out as leaders among normal-sized men? What?
Well, I can tell you this because it usually went to their appetites, both for physical. I mean, the giants fell out of a fellowship or friendship even when there was kind of a mutual truce because, people quit or they tired quickly of trying to feed these guys. And also the sexual habitats. I go into a situation of the sexual habits and the different habitats of the giants. I mean, these guys were, and no pun intended here, but they made rape, pillage, and plunder seem like child's play. There's actually an account in my book of one of the chroniclers of the conquistadors talking about a literal group of giants that were running the jungle literally being wiped out by the thunderbolts of heaven. Whether people believe that or not, I can only tell you this, that some guy in 1590, when he's tracking that story down, sure hasn't read Marvel Comics.
Okay, I can see that. Well, then have you talked about the sexual practices thing before on Coast to Coast? I know you were on with George back in July.
Yeah, no, I think we've never touched on that because, that gets into the book, and I think it's important. We'll do that, delicately and in good taste.
All right. Then do you want to just go back and clear up the thing about the nasal sounds?
Sure. Interesting. Brian Snowdy, who's one of the best historic artists in the world, and I got to tell you, he's the guy that did the drawings that are on my website of the Mayans and the Incas. There was a thing that was noted in so many archaeological accounts, and also even in Nepal, about a thing called harmonic levitation. And it's recorded that the giants were able to create such an incredible kind of shrill noise that they could literally change the weight. Now, I don't know how they did it. I'm just telling you that this is what's recorded. And that when they would do that, somehow they were able to actually levitate or move incredibly large and heavy objects. It's called harmonic levitation.
Okay. Well, let's stop there for the moment, and then we'll get into everything else because there's still so much in this material. The books of Stephen Quayle, you can link up to his website at coasttocoastam.com.
When you've got a certain condition of the pituitary gland, it can cause your growth hormone to continue to function as opposed to shutting down. But what usually happens, you have an implied weakness. Your muscles ultimately give out. Most people that suffer from gigantism in that realm usually die very young. I don't think Andre the Giant was very old when he died. I think he was in his mid-30s or maybe early 40s. But the point is that the giants of history, these guys are all incredibly long-lived and long-lived.
Right.
And they're stronger than anything. And also, I once got called on the carpet when someone said, well, there's no study showing that a bigger brain means implied intelligence. And I said, well, I can only tell you this, that if you will even grant to me the idea that mankind didn't just all of a sudden get, become smarter and smarter. He was taught amazing feats of science and technology. And for the reference I use on that is the Book of Enoch, which is one of the oldest non-biblical, when I say it's not included in the canon of Scripture.
Right, non-canonical, we would say.
Right, non-canonical. But the point is the Book of Enoch has got a fascinating history. Now, they have found the Book of Giants in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I also have on my website, my main Giants website, and people can go and read, because it leads us into the question, what were their sexual habits of the giants? Listen, they went after everything. They didn't stop with women. They didn't stop with their fellow male giants. They didn't stop with children. They went after the animals. And that's, again, when you understand the mythology of whether it's Egyptian mythology or Greek mythology, when you get into all of everything from the Cyclops to the satyrs, et cetera, you come into a whole different realm, because they obviously have a different life force. They have a different energy. And by the way, the metabolism of these individuals, I was told by some very bright men who are into this, tracking, and whether people accept this or not, but their body temperature is in the neighborhood of, they run hot because of their metabolism, about 250, 275 degrees. That's Fahrenheit. We're at 98.6. So their appetites are literally ferocious.
They're burning through a lot of calories. But on the photos, on these really cool photos, and again, Stephen, just, congratulations. I really mean it. Wonderful job on cataloging some photos I have never seen, including some of the biggest dang people that could ever have existed, it seems. And so I ask you, though, why, when we look at those photos, do we think that those are giants as opposed to people who are suffering from giganticism?
Well,
why do we think they didn't die a week after that photo was taken, for example?
Well, because in so many of the cases, and when you click on them, you can basically get the background, like Jean Petrucin. I mean, that guy was a circus giant. He's the guy that looks like a Viking in some of the pictures on my website.
Right.
That man was phenomenally strong. He lived to be, very old-aged, and, I mean, he was huge, okay?
But he was not you're saying he wasn't one of the pituitary giants?
He was not a pituitary entity.
Okay.
The other thing that you asked me a while back, and again, Ian, you know, there's like, you know, a million years of history to cover in 2 hours, 3 hours.
Sure.
But here's the deal. The anomalous event that the Bible and ancient history records is that the giants that they were talking about 6 fingers, 6 toes, okay, and double sets of teeth. And that's a fascinating subject because even when you get, and I don't want to get into that yet in case you want to go there, but even the Roswell crashed UFO panel was set up for 6 fingers on 2 hands, okay? And most people don't even know that. But what you're dealing with is you're dealing with unusual physiological characteristics. Now, medical science says if you have 6 fingers on one hand, it's called polydactylism, okay?
Right.
That's not unusual. 6 fingers, 6 toes, very unusual. Double sets of teeth, very unusual. Well, invariably, when I do a show on Coast to Coast with George, and I'm sure it'll happen after we're done on this, I'll get calls from all over the country, and people say, my son had 6 fingers, 6 toes, double sets of teeth. What does that mean? And I say, I would love to have some of his DNA, a piece of hair. Because, again, what's fascinating is that some people may have one or the other. Unless they have all 3 sets, they don't have to worry. If they've got all 3 sets, in other words, a double 6 fingers, 6 toes,
right,
and double sets of teeth, then you've got something. I got news for you. The guys in black, meaning the men in black, would be to their house before I would. Because, again, see, here's a question that has to be asked.
No, but could you be polydactyl and have 2 sets of teeth and just be normally sized?
Well, forgive me, but I have yet to come across anybody that fits that.
Okay. I
have had people call me who have told me that their uncles or their grandfathers were 8 feet tall, and they died. That is not in their current lineage, but they had all 3 of the requirements. And one lady said, does that mean, I'm a giant? And I said, well, how tall are you? And she said, 5'10". I said, nope, that doesn't qualify.
Right.
So here's the thing. I can't tell at this point, this is ongoing. I can't tell what it takes to accelerate that. But if you're burning the metabolism, if the giant's body temperature is that high, and you've got to then understand that obviously the cellular structure that's making the energy in the cell has got to be at a phenomenal rate. So that means it's vibrating or it has a higher harmony or a higher frequency. And so, there's stuff there that I just physically don't have the answers for.
Right.
And that's what all the spooks are looking for. And I'm telling you, when I tell you this, the spooks are out there. I think one of the most important things I've got to draw everyone's attention to is the amulet that's on my website, okay? Did you see the amulet?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. The amulet, and the reason why this is important, this is about 4,000 years old, okay? This was given to a lady that came to physically seek me out. Her father in Turkey received it, whenever it's on the website. But if you notice the headdress on this gentleman, it looks, and for those who are listening on the radio that aren't on the internet right now, the guy is at least, based on the size of the individual, he's at least 10 feet tall. But what's interesting is his head is almost conical shaped, and that matches the 7 sages in Nemrut Dog, and I don't know if you've been there.
No, I haven't.
Okay. But in essence, there are 7 giant thrones in Turkey, and one of the heads on the individual statues that's fallen over looks identical to this gentleman on the amulet. The little guy looks like he's an alien, and again, there's a standard spiel that this was a cosmogony empire, which absolutely, I've talked to the archaeologists, some of them that work there, and I said, Steve, this thing is so old, it predates Alexander and Antiochus and everybody.
Well, I wonder, too, whether you've heard of this, and I don't know because I've tried to get to as many of the links as I could on your website, so pardon me if I'm telling you something you already know all about. The Stick Indians?
Right.
Of the Yakimas, the legends of the Stick Indians. This was sent to me by Joe in Texas. He said they were the spirit brothers of the Yakimas. They were a lot like what we think of as Big Feet or Sasquatches. Their legends in a nutshell is that they lived in the woods like animals without houses. They wore grizzly bear hair clothings. It was said that when they needed a new garment, they would stalk a grizzly about their own size, kill it, and skin it out. Since they didn't use tools except a long stick that they carried, they would skin the bear with their fingernails. They would then make monk-like hoods with the bear's heads and drape their cloak down to their feet. The bear's arms and legs were tied around the stick Indians' arms and legs. They were highly feared by the Yakimas. They were treated with great caution and respect.
The greatest evidence of giants in the United States, believe it or not, is and has been in Florida, because the Carib Indians, from which we get the word Caribbean, were also cannibals, and there are people that dispute that. But after doing the last show I did with George on giants, a lady archaeologist called me and told me of the incredible finds that they have found. I'm sure she's listening tonight. And, the fascinating thing about Florida is that Florida seemed to have had a sea route of a lot of the very large individuals that settled both Latin America and South America when they headed north. And this is something that most people don't understand. The burial mounds in the Pennsylvania, Ohio Valley region, where the serpent mounds are and stuff, even into Missouri, there have been massive. I would say this. I have probably in my files over 1,000 cases of old newspapers talking about 12 to 14-foot giants and talking about, again, the cannibalistic nature of them in the United States. And, for a long time, until, good night, Nature magazine or Discover magazine came out, a lot of people wouldn't realize that the Anasazi, which are the ancient ones, they fought the idea of cannibalism in the desert Southwest until they found out there were a lot of bones with human teeth marks on them. And, so let me share this. The cannibalistic practices throughout the world, I have spent almost 2 decades tracking to the giants. That doesn't mean that all cannibals are giants, because you can go into New Guinea and find normal. But the introduction of that practice, again, with the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayas, they not only practiced ritual sacrifice, they practiced, a 3-course meal out of the different captives they were able to conquer in battle.
All right. And then just to wrap it up to make sure we included it all on there, what about their sexual practices, the giants' sexual practices, might have led to their demise, or at least to being diminished around the globe?
Well, from a standpoint of God, in my opinion, set barriers, and this is one of the reasons why in the Old Testament there are specific, men are forbidden to lie with beasts, and if a man lied with the beast, both the person or persons who lied with the beast were put to death. And the beast was too, and I always thought that was unfair, because I don't think that beast had a vote in that. Right, but here's the deal, okay? You've got to understand that when Noah, listen, the bloodlines, that Coast has had different stories with bloodlines, but Noah and his family were preserved because they were perfect in their generations. These giants literally went after everybody and everything. They corrupted every God-ordained barrier that was possible to corrupt. And when you get into the Oannes, O-A-N-N-E-S myth, when you get into Poseidon and you get into Neptune and you get into all this stuff, you'll find that all of the gods of the Greeks and Romans all trace back to a literal and physical giant that assumed godlike qualities because of their power, their intelligence, not only their prowess, but also, look, they dominated with a heavy tooth, literally.
Right. Well, but if we go to the story of Noah, though, you believe that the giants survived the flood.
I believe the giants were destroyed in the flood. I believe that after the flood, there was a secondary time of angelic visitation with women.
Oh, okay.
And see, because that's how you explain Goliath. Goliath, by the way, and his brothers, when David went down to the brook Kidron to get 5 smooth stones, not only was David going to take care of Goliath, but his brothers. And it specifically states that they were 6-fingered, 6-toed individuals.
What?
Now, where it's going now, in my opinion, is again the attempt is going to be made genetically with mankind cooperating to his own destruction. The idea is to find the DNA to produce transhuman entities and basically say goodbye to mankind. And you know, in my book, Genetic Armageddon, that's why I titled it that, because that's what we're headed to, in my opinion.
But Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh was a giant in that epic?
Yes, sir.
Okay. If Noah was based on the story of Gilgamesh, and there's some debate about that, but
he wasn't, because Noah was perfect in his generation. It by the very definition, I know what you're going for, and I just want to clarify. There is no indication that Noah was Gilgamesh. Listen, form critics, as you know, and everybody can take apart the Noah's flood, but, you know, it's still argued, was a flood global or universal? Yet explain, you know, seashells on Mount Everest, and I think that kind of blows that it was local.
Okay. But it would explain how giants, without having to have a second wave of angelic visitation, if Noah were a giant or had, you know, a giant genes anyway, it could have explained how that continued on if Gilgamesh and Noah were related. But you say they aren't, so we'll just leave that there for now. And say that we'll give all the numbers. And as you heard me say at the beginning of this, I know where it's going to start. I have no idea where it's going to end. How do you believe this pursuit for giants will lead to a genetic Armageddon?
Well, first of all, I believe that there's a very malevolent force in the universe, Satan, that is bent on destroying all humanity. And I believe that the words of Jesus, he said, if the days weren't short, there'd be no flesh left alive, no descendants of Adam. I believe in a replacement transhumans. And, you know, when you've got the technology that's headed towards basically being able to combine human and animal DNA, which is probably one of the greatest affronts, I believe, in heaven, if you look at the history of even the pre-Adamic civilizations like Lemuria, Mu, Atlantis, when the inhabitants of those areas, whether you believe it or not, when they got into this realm, it's when the destruction came. And I believe, Ian, what it is it's a harbinger of a total destructive phase. Listen, these guys aren't only dealing with DNA of giants, they're also dealing with viruses that have been dormant, have been set in suspended animation, that once they're released, it makes the bird flu and the combination viruses of mouse pox and Ebola pox and everything else seem like Little League.
Well,
and it's my contention that mankind is incredibly arrogant, and that in their contempt for God, they have taken the place that science can answer all things, but when you can see only to step 3 and it's step 7 that kills you, I think now mankind has gone beyond the threshold, and in my opinion, we're at about step 5. Because when you're dealing with genetic Armageddon, when you're dealing with recombinant DNA, and you're combining animal and human DNA, and you're getting things like the chimeras or chimeras, when you're getting humansies, humans, chimpanzees, the point is that there were God-given barriers. Now that man is learning how to fool and mess around with this stuff. And by the way, it's fascinating when you go and read some of the old hieroglyphics. It's almost like some of the pharaohs knew that their chance at a second shot wasn't by obeying the Book of the Dead, but that, their gods, little g's, would bring them back in the later time. So it is my contention that genetic Armageddon means the last battle for the real human seed versus a transhuman or hybrid seed. And as, we haven't even got to that whole thing, but when you deal with the alien issue, I don't believe that the aliens, the Anunnaki, came here and created us, and I call them the Anunnaki, because it seems like they're going an awful long distance to mess around with human females. And the point is that you're dealing now with a subject that what the giants did, the fallen angels were able to accomplish by cohabiting with earth women based on the book of Genesis and the book of Jude, now, quote, the aliens are doing to bring about a race. Because you're dealing, obviously, and please, there's so many different ideas on the aliens, but I deal with that in my book called Aliens and Fallen Angels, the Sexual Corruption of the Human Race. And for those that want to know, this is not a, quote, just flash in the pan for me. I've spent a lot of time, and when I talk to scientists, when I talk to double and triple PhD people, There are the ones that will talk on record. They're the ones that will talk off record. And I got to tell you, Ian, the ones that talk off record are the ones that are telling you the truth. There are, again, in South America, there are literally accounts written and chronicled by the conquistadors where they're interviewing the different natives, and they talk about literally lightning bolts from heaven killing some of these guys. So, whether people believe that or not, the lightning bolts, I would say, figure very prominently into the destruction of the giants.
Well, I guess in a way, part of that would just seem to make sense in that lightning would be attracted to the tallest structure that was around. So,
hey, good point.
I mean, in that way, there would be some scientific evidence to say that giants would be likely candidates for a lightning strike.
And you could go on even to take that a little further, because again, when you're talking about just the simple temperature, body temperature, and the mineralization in the giants, you would also be, basically a walking lightning rod, not
Sure.
just because of the stature, but by the mineralization due to the metabolism. So you bring up two fascinating points. There are literal records of some of these guys being able to lift 10,000 pounds. Now, you've got the Stone of the Pregnant Woman in Baalbek, Lebanon, which is absolutely non-explainable in the natural. Number one, how a stone of that size could be quarried, and number two, how it could be moved. And when you've got the literal multi-thousand-year-old references to what's called harmonic levitation, not to mention if a guy can lift 10,000 pounds with one hand, 10 tons with two, the point is that these are physical records of these individuals being able to lift that. So, again, it is my contention that they were built by the Nephilim, and pyramids, for the record, are worldwide. They're certainly not, only in the Middle East, and they're all over the world.
Right, but just to be clear on J-Man's question, built with their noses?
No,
okay.
Built with their hands, but they were able to change. When I say built with their noses, I'm telling you that there are recorded cases of harmonic levitation, which the Buddhists to this day in Nepal claim is how they built their temples on the rocks.
Okay.
So the point is, I'm saying, coupled with the strength, and again, you've got stones in some of the different areas around the world in the temples that are so uniquely cut. There's no way to even deal with that in a modern situation or setting.
Let's go to the international line where Bruce is waiting for Stephen Quayle on Coast to Coast AM. Bruce?
Oh, hello. Hello?
Hello?
Yeah. Hello, Ian. Question for Stephen there is, I was listening a few weeks ago and you had Patrick Heron on.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds similar on the business of giants. And I'm just wondering if Stephen has any knowledge of Patrick Heron, or if they've communicated, or if their research resembles their, as
good question. Number one, I know Patrick Heron. Number two, I've read his book. Number three, the research. When you've got a common thread of truth, he's going to take it. He basically is going from the structures that have been built by these individuals, and I'm going from where it's going to go from here. So Patrick and I are basically of the same agreement that it's the Nephilim that basically have influenced humanity and given us the structures along with all of the technology and the education that is out there in antiquity. I don't believe that we are getting smarter in the, this day and age. I believe our forefathers and these entities, let's call them that, were incredibly intelligent. But I believe, as Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. That which will be has already been.
Well, let me ask you, how come there aren't more articles in the mainstream media or more television coverage about something as sensational as what you are writing about?
Well, I think that's a great question. That's the bottom line. We should have gotten to the bottom line. Just like the last scene in the Raiders of the Lost Ark, there has been an intentional cover-up of trying to keep all of this stuff hidden. The mainstream classic historians teach isolationism. In other words, everybody stayed in their own little locale. There was no spirit of adventure, and the United States was discovered by Leif Erikson, then Columbus. That's hogwash. There are so many indications of, Egyptians all over the world, from Australia to the United States. I have on my website an important story that everybody should see. In 1909, the Phoenix Gazette carried the story about Professor Kincaid finding an Egyptian necropolis in the Grand Canyon. Keep in mind that the Grand Canyon had a higher water table in those days. But over and over and over, after doing a show on Coast to Coast, I will get contacted by people who have been in the military, people who have been in science, then they'll say the same thing. We can't say what you're saying, but we want you to know that this, and this has been found. So it's kind of like this. You have to control the not only the subject matter, but you have to make sure that the press is controlled so that the stuff doesn't leak out. And I maintain that the time is over for that. They're not going to be able to contain it that much longer. But I believe it's literally everything that has to do with the subject matter I am talking about tonight is absolutely censored.
Welcome back. We're with Dr. Greg Little, psychologist turned explorer, and a great one indeed. Greg, tell us a little bit about Path of Souls.
Well, Path of Souls explains what the America's ancient mound builders believed about death, what happens at death, the soul. And back when I got interested in the mounds and the mound building cultures, which was actually in the 1980s, up until just recent years, I figured that no one would ever know what these people believed, that no one would ever know what a lot of the strange artifacts that have been pulled out of mounds meant. These artifacts are very, very weird. A lot of them, well, some are on your website now, which you have several good photographs of. Mm-hmm. They depict the eye and hand symbol. It's basically like an eye in a palm of a hand. That's been found on somewhere around 50 artifacts that have been pulled out of Native American mounds. There's a host of other artifacts that show skulls with what looks like fire coming out of them, single bones like an ulna, and many others. Some show like a crossbar, almost like a big plus sign, which in the past has been interpreted by archaeologists as the sun. But actually, all of those things are not what they originally appeared to be. The truth about what these groups believed had actually been recovered in the 1700s and the 1800s. And as I put on a video that really is not truly available yet, they became lost because they went into libraries and these old books. They weren't digitized, and archaeologists started digging into mounds trying to pull out artifacts for display. So the written information was lost. But beginning in the 1990s, a group of archaeologists, roughly 25 of them, met at Texas State University every year for around 15 years, and they pulled out a lot of these old books. They did statistical analyses. They actually looked at the old legends and came up with this idea. So I wish I had come up with it. What I have simply done is summarize it. But it goes back to the time when the mounds were first built, why they built these incredible geometric earthworks, how the elite, the priests and the chiefs, maintained control over these cultures, and why it explains a lot of other strange things, like why some people were interred in really well-built stone chambers inside of mounds, and why other people were essentially cremated. There are also mounds that had literally thousands of human remains in them, just kind of jumbled haphazardly. But this Path of Souls explains the death journey, which begins with two souls. According to Native American beliefs, we have two souls. One of them is called the life soul, and the way to think of that is that it animates us. It's drawn from the earth, and the earth has a spirit and a life of its own. And when the body forms, there is this mindless energy that animates us, and that is the life soul. When you die, there is another soul that separates from the physical body, and it is called the free soul because it is free of the body. The life soul, though, clings to the human remains when you die. And if you don't do something with those human remains, this life soul, the natives believed, was dangerous. It could haunt the area. It could cause diseases with other people. It was like a ghost. So they believed that you had to pretty much cremate any human remains that were left and return them back to dust, so that energy could go back to the Earth Mother. The free soul then took a trip to the west, and then on this trip to the west, it only had like 3 days to take this trip. It reached a body of water, and then in the morning, actually, if people go outside now, don't quit listening to the radio, but if you're outside now, take a look to the west. Actually, it'll be pretty much almost vertical now. You will see 3 stars sort of in a line. We call it the Belt of Orion, but the natives saw that as a hand star. It was a severed wrist. The three belt stars of Orion formed a severed wrist, and this wrist falls in the western horizon. Right now, it'll fall about 4 o'clock in the morning or 4:40 in the morning Central Time, and right before the sun rises. And so the hand goes down, and the first thing you see that goes down is Orion's Nebula, which the Maya called that Shilbaba. But the soul had to take a leap toward Orion when it was right on the western horizon, and it aimed for Orion's Nebula, which is the eye in the hand, and it's an Ogee, O-G-E-E. The Ogee is a portal, and once it got into that, then, of course, the sun would come up, you can't see the stars anymore, and Orion essentially then goes around the Earth, and the next night it all goes on again. But that Ogee allowed this soul to go through the underworld safely and then emerge the next day or the next night on what is called the Path of Souls, which is the Milky Way.
They had it all worked out, didn't they?
Yes, they did. Oh, this is incredibly complex. I'm really just trying to give a simple explanation.
Yeah.
On this, they believed that the stars of the Milky Way were souls making a journey. That's why it is called the Path of Souls. Some tribes called it the River of Souls. Some call it the Wolf Trail, because when you're on this trail, you encounter dogs or wolves. But eventually, you reach a spot on the Milky Way where you meet a judge, and they called it an adversary. And this is very Egyptian-like. This adversary performs it's a judgment of the soul. And the judgment has to do with the goodness of the soul, how it served its tribe, its family, and how it dealt with its enemies. This judge was a raptor bird, usually a eagle, a hawk, a falcon. And if the person passed the judgment, they then made a choice. They were at the dark rift of the Milky Way at this point, and they could go one direction or the other. One way was a dead end, and if you actually look at the dark rift, you'll see one branch is a dead end, and the other led on to an opening in the upper world, which they believed was a huge dome or a sphere, and you popped out of this, and then you return to the land of the ancestors, which is really where all the souls are. It's where all the souls start and where most of the souls return, but not all.
Now, Greg, what was Cayce's tie-in to this?
Well, Cayce did talk. Well, first of all, the Native Americans, in this belief, you could make a choice. Families could choose that their dead could reincarnate. Reincarnation is a part of this. It's also like the soul sojourns to different worlds. You would jump to the stars. Your soul would go to the stars. And it was some sort of an evolutionary development of the soul. It's very, very similar to Cayce, which I found quite odd when I started reading this. They would take babies, for example, that would die, and if they would be very upset and they'd want another one, they'd want the same soul to return. They actually buried the baby in its entirety in a hill very close to wherever they were living, and if you kept that body together, there was a chance that in the future that particular free soul and the life soul could rejoin. That's why they put the elite in tombs, because sometimes they wanted this leader to reincarnate and come back. But if you did not want to come back, then your bones had to be literally ground into dust or burned, so you could not come back and rejoin with that same life soul. Therefore, you couldn't reincarnate. Some souls actually slipped and fell during this journey to the sky, and they either went into the underworld or they reincarnated. And there was another creature, a spider. I mean, it's very complicated. But it's just really interesting. That kind of leads into the giants, too, because these elite were generally very, very tall people. They were hereditary. Having the status of being elite wasn't because you were good at what you did. It was hereditary. You were born into it. And for one reason or another, these were exceptionally tall people. And there's very good evidence of that. Some people have called them giants, but archaeologists hate that word giants.
Yeah. And how tall do you think they were, Greg?
Well, we know how tall they were. They were between 7 and 8 feet tall. The evidence is real clear at this.
Not really big then.
Well, no, that's pretty big. When you're talking to, I stood next to Wilt.
We've got 7-footers now. That's my point.
Yeah, we do. But let me tell you how many there are. It is one of every 146,000 people. That's the exact statistic. One of every 146,000 people is actually 7 feet tall. Now, that's not very many. And in their world, and that's based on modern statistics, in their world, where their height was 5 foot, their average height was 5'4" in the Adena population, where most of these were.
Like the Mayans. The Maya, they were small people, too.
Yes, they were like 5'2".
Yeah.
On the average. And so if you actually apply the real statistics to all this, what you come up with is like one of every 1.5 million people at that time reached 7 feet in height. But somebody who's say 7 feet 8 inches tall or 8 feet tall, if you stand next to that person and they are proportional, that is, they're not skinny, they look like a giant.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's no doubt. But to me, show me a 9-foot giant or a 10-footer. That's a giant.
Yeah, there you go. Well, I can't do that. What we focused on, and Andrew Collins and I did an analysis of this, we took all the old Smithsonian reports, which is actually 842 pages, and found 17 that the Smithsonian pulled out in their mound excavations in 1882 to 1890. They found 17. And then the University of Kentucky pulled 7-footers, 7.5-footers out in 1950. The Carnegie Museum pulled them out in 1958. And another group of archaeologists did the same thing in 1956. And all of these that archaeologists did. Now, I'm not talking about all the newspaper reports where they reported people much taller. We decided to look at the actual reports done by archaeologists during real excavations. So what we came up with, the truly valid reports that cannot be denied by mainstream archaeology, there's around 30 7-footers to 8-footers that were pulled out of American mounds over a relatively short period of time. And if you multiply those out, you'd have to pull out somewhere around 10 to 12 million skeletons at the time. Actually, more than that. It'd be more like 35 million if you use the Adena heights to come up with that many tall people. And that's a lot of skeletons. We know the Smithsonian didn't pull out 40,000 during their entire period of digging in the mounds. They dug into 2,000 mounds, but they only came up with 40,000 artifacts. We don't know how many skeletons they actually found, but we know they found 17 that were 7 feet to 8 feet in height. So that's what Andrew Collins and I did. We really looked at the archaeological publications. We did run down quite a few of the others where there are these reports of much taller people. Several of those do have validity to a point. The problem is that at some point the evidence just kind of ends. There's nothing else that we can do with it. So you have one article that leads to another, and you can go back into time, but where you're left is some individuals in a town somewhere, maybe a local doctor is named, and they reported finding these skeletons, but no archaeologist has measured them. That's the problem. Archaeologists don't accept that stuff. So we wanted to get the ones that they themselves actually pulled out to see what was there. But there's far too many of these 7 to 8 footers statistically. Something was going on in that world, and we know through the legends that the Native Americans had what that was. The legends were very clear, and all that was done in the 1700s and 1800s. The legends said that in very early times, these huge people came into the Americas when there were already people here. They were very fierce warriors. They really couldn't resist them. But not only were they fierce warriors, they had abilities and knowledge that far exceeded what the native populations had. These tall people are Native Americans too. I want to make that clear.
So you don't think they were extraterrestrial or anything like that?
No, I don't think they were extraterrestrial, no. You could go back, and an argument can always be made that there's extraterrestrial intervention that went on at some point, some sort of genetic intervention. And I've written, it's in the path of souls. I've committed to it. I do believe that sometime in the ancient past, there probably was, statistically speaking, it's probable that there were visitations in the past. And there's a lot of things laying around on the earth that are very, very strange. To me, the best evidence is, though, the legends from Native Americans that tell us that their remote ancestors came from the stars. That's very clear, but that's their really first ancestors. And some of the legends actually say that in the beginning there were these advanced beings that came down and created man and woman. That's actually Cherokee legends. And those were recorded by the Smithsonian in the 1800s. So that's old stuff. But
it appears so that the Smithsonian seems to have hidden some of this stuff.
Well, they can't really hide it. They just don't like to talk about it. And I've concluded that the Smithsonian's problem is one of three things. One is just utter stupidity, which I know there's been some stupidity. They should have addressed this giants thing, but they didn't. Another is abject incompetence, which we know, too, with in recent years, the Smithsonian has come under intense scrutiny because of financial issues, and it's pretty clear that they have they had at least some real problems there in recent years. Or the third thing is that there has been a real conspiracy, and I don't know what to say about that. I do know this. You've had David Childress on, and some years ago, David Childress talked about the Arizona newspaper article, the front page newspaper article that came out in 1909 about an Egyptian artifacts recovered from a cave system in the Grand Canyon. There was a Professor Jordan who supposedly was affiliated with the Smithsonian who was involved with that, along with a guy by the name of Kincaid. Childress made that known in the early 1990s, and the Smithsonian put out press release after press release that there had never been a Professor Jordan ever working or affiliated with them. Archaeologists have repeated this, and there are textbooks out, mainstream archaeology textbooks, that say there has never been a Professor Jordan ever worked for or affiliated with the Smithsonian. But if you go on the Smithsonian website, and you actually go back, you can find in 2008, they issued a page about a Professor Jordan who worked with them for 30 years, who actually did make a trip into the Grand Canyon.
Why did we have, and why do we have, two souls based on their perception?
Well, it's real similar to the Egyptian idea of the Ba and the Ka. One soul is physical. It comes from physical matter. It animates the body, and that's called the life soul. It allows the body to move, but it's also the source of hauntings, ghosts, probably poltergeist phenomena or anything else like that. That particular soul comes from a sort of a coalescing of physical matter to provide a vehicle for the free soul, the thing that we really define as our real soul. The life soul has no memory. It has no free will per se. It's just kind of a free-floating energy that coalesces together. But it's dangerous unless it's dealt with. That's the point to it. This other soul, the free soul, is what most of us define as a soul. It has a memory. It has sort of a personality. It has a real history. And it sort of stays together. It doesn't dissipate after death. It stays together into a unified whole, and it moves on. Or it can re-enter something else that's physical on Earth and essentially reincarnate. But that gets really complicated at that point. Why did they believe it? I do not know. I know what the beliefs are, but I'm kind of dumbfounded by some of it. Why did the Egyptians believe that we had two different souls also? I mean, I don't know. I think these beliefs go way, way back in time, probably to roughly 20,000 years ago. 18,000 BC is the date that Andrew and I have pretty much settled on, and that has to do with the way the constellations were in the sky and what the North Pole Star was, because they believed that these souls went through a portal that was once at the North Pole. And again, going back into these ancient legends, it points back to antiquity, true antiquity, 18,000 years ago or more. The giants didn't appear to enter the scene until the time mounds were first beginning to be built, and they were real clear about how they came in. They were seen as invaders, but they brought knowledge, and they sound like the Nephilim. They brought knowledge of cultivation. Maize entered the Americas, or corn entered the Americas from Mexico around the same time that mounds started being built. And they learned other types of cultivation. And the civilization in the Americas took a rather profound leap forward about the time that mounds were built. And that goes back to between 4,000 BC and 3,000 BC. And it appears that's about the time that this almost invasion of giants occurred. And there weren't a lot of these taller people. The legends say that some of them were twice as tall as the natives, and they do say that point blank.
Okay.
Other legends say that, the more recent legends say that they called them giants, but they said they were just exceptionally tall people. Noticeably taller, and that they were proportional in size, so they had a frightening appearance. And it also says they were cannibals, and that's interesting too.
I had heard that, and it's kind of frightening, isn't it?
Yes, that is frightening, but that's a good way to control the population. Supposedly, well, in more way than one. I didn't mean that how it sounded. Supposedly, these people had the knowledge and the power over life and death and reincarnation. And the populace gave them their power and turned them into the elite because they controlled the death journey through the manipulation of these symbols that we talked about briefly, some of which are on the Coast to Coast website. And they also they controlled the population, building the mounds and building the earthworks, and these were ritualistic devices. The earthworks, the geometric earthworks, were ritualistic devices, almost machines, that were employed to assist souls making a transition between this world and the next, and allowing souls to come back in. So they were devices, and it explains a lot of things that have been absolutely unknown, such as why did they build some of these massive geometric formations like in Newark, Ohio. It's an incredible place, or the geometric earthworks that were at Portsmouth, Ohio, which are just as incredible as Newark, but most of them have been destroyed there. But they built hundreds of these things, octagons, huge concentric circles made out of earthen rings that were 12 to 15 feet high, miles and miles of earthworks, walkways that went 56 miles that were lined on each side by parallel lines of earth. All this has to do with rituals and manipulation of the soul. And supposedly all of it was done at the behest of these elite people who were really tall people because they had this power. And the legends also tell us how they disappeared or how they got rid of them and why. And that's an interesting story in and of itself. And it's a lot like Cayce's story of the end of Atlantis.
All right, what happened to them?
Well, two things happened. All the Native American legends say that these giants, as the elite, as they got more and more powerful, they became corrupt, that they demanded more and more from the population. And finally, when their demands reached the point of what is called in these legends sexual improprieties, the population rose against them and exterminated them. That last sentence was a quote from one of the native legends. The few that were left fled, and I believe they fled south, and they went into what is called the Mississippian mound culture, and there weren't a lot of them left by the time Hernando de Soto came.
Would that have been like Cahokia mounds?
Yes, the time of Cahokia, yes. Most of these giant skeletons have been pulled out of the Ohio River Valley. The Kanawha River in West Virginia is one where there were a lot of them. That's the biggest concentration. But they've been found elsewhere, too. But the real concentration of them are Adena-era mounds, really old mounds going back to about 1000 B.C. and before in that Ohio River Valley. But there were mounds built earlier in the south, and, of course, the Mississippian era, which came later, built the big pyramid-shaped mounds. And that's Cahokia and Moundville. Spiro, Oklahoma is another example, in Etowah, Georgia. There's hundreds of those sites. There were a lot of mounds. There's probably 100,000 still in existence.
100,000? Why so many, Greg?
100,000 mounds probably still in existence. Most of those are relatively small burial mounds, and those are the ones that archaeologists really like to excavate because they found the most in those. And a lot of those have very elaborate stone chambers in them. And I am not a proponent for excavating. Somebody actually posted that we shouldn't be digging into mounds. We don't dig into mounds and never have, never will. And at this point, I don't really know any archaeologists who are doing any active excavations into mounds anymore because they can't. Since 1990, the passage of the law called NAGPRA, N-A-G-P-R-A, has pretty much prohibited that without the Native American tribal permission, and that's almost impossible to get. So from that aspect, American archaeology and real excavations, it's at a standstill. There's still archaeology going on, but it's mainly archaeology that is coming in before construction is being done. When roads are built, they have to come in and do a survey to make sure they're not going to destroy anything. That's an example. And that's most of the archaeology going on today. It's not excavating mounds, which I wish we could do a few, because I'm sure there are some of these very tall people still in there. And with genetic testing, we could find out where these people came from, and if, in fact, they do have some sort of a genetic link to perhaps Denisovans, as several people, including Andrew Collins, have suggested. I don't really know who they are, But unless genetic testing is done, we will never know for certain, and that's the only way to do it.
Getting back to these double souls, Greg, I've always believed that that's a possibility because a couple things happen, especially on this show. One, people call in and they've talked about how they have seen their dearly departed visit them. And then on the other hand, it happens like months after they have died, where I have assumed they have moved on or they've already been reincarnated. And I'm trying to say to myself while these calls are coming in, well, how can the soul be visiting a loved one months after they probably have already moved on? And it didn't click. It does now when you say that there could be two of them.
Well, that does make good sense, and the truth is I've never thought of it that way either, but that makes really good sense. It does explain things like hauntings where you have the same thing happening over and over. And as you said that, what I was thinking of, I have been in hospitals after close relatives have had massive strokes or have had other problems, and their body is alive and their body is functioning, but the person you know is no longer there. And a lot of times, my wife has said sometimes, their soul has checked out. Their soul, what we consider the soul, has moved on, but the body doesn't know it. The body stays alive, and that makes sense from that perspective too. And maybe that's where they got the idea from, because surely somebody would have been physically alive but not been there, if you know what I mean. Personality-wise, they're gone. So that makes sense.
They are gone. Back to Edgar Cayce then for a moment. How significant were these mounds to him?
Well, Cayce really had... I interviewed Edgar Cayce about mounds back in... it was actually around 1999, before Edgar Evans died. And Edgar Evans was his son, and the Cayces lived in several areas where there were lots of mounds, and Edgar Evans said that, well, they talked about mounds being in the area a few times, he said, but they never visited a single one. There were 68 Cayce readings that mentioned mounds. Out of the 14,000-plus readings, there were only 68 that talked about Indian mounds. And they were not given a great deal of importance. There was a lot of information in those 68 readings. One example is he said that mound building began in the south and moved northward to Ohio, which at the time he said that, archaeology textbooks said mound building began in the Ohio River Valley and then spread elsewhere, but we now know it did in fact begin in the south around the time frame Cayce said, 3000 BC, and then went north, so he was correct. But to Cayce himself and his family, it really wasn't important to them. Cayce was struggling to make a living as a photographer. So they just did not visit mounds and didn't have an interest in any of that. And that's really, it's peculiar when you think about it.
Well, it really is. So of everything that you've been working on with Edgar Cayce, everything he's done, what do you find to be the most significant aspect of his life?
Wow. The health readings, clearly. They helped so many people. And the health readings are very accurate. Since those were done, the ARE has made a concerted effort to collate those. The ARE it's got 25 to 30,000 members. A lot of them are physicians, health researchers, nurses, psychologists. Every profession you can imagine is in it. And they have made health protocols for almost every disease you can think of, which is a listing of all the things Cayce said to do for this disorder. So pretty clearly the health readings are probably the most important thing overall, at least to me. Some people would say it's the spirituality. I definitely have an interest in the things Cayce said about the ancient world, but I have to admit, if I stack that up against people's health and well-being is more important than anything I would do about looking at the ancient world. I am, however, fascinated with the Native American beliefs. I am very fascinated with these ideas of star people and how far this goes back and what else could be found about it. The Native American beliefs are probably the closest thing we have that just flat says our ancestors came from the stars. They say it very, very plainly, and it's just clear that their legends and their myths are not what people think of as myths. There's got to be some basis to it. There's some truth to these stories.
Greg, two separate astronomical groups are saying now that there could be 2 extra planets in the solar system. We've had guests on the air here for years who've talked about the possibility of a planet X, an extra planet in the solar system. Did Edgar Cayce ever address that?
I have no idea. He probably did, since he addressed virtually everything. But I don't know. He may have, but I don't know. In the next break, I will find out. Okay.
Now, with those health readings that he gave, and I've got a book that I got which shows most of his natural remedies. You know, he talks about eating 3 natural almonds a day to prevent cancer and things like that. You know what? I bet a lot of medical prescriptions are based on some of the things he said.
Oh, absolutely. Cayce really talked about, a balanced diet, but it goes beyond that. He talked about eating fresh fruit and vegetables, not a lot of red meat. Fish is something he talked about. And if you actually break these things down, he was talking about taking things like niacin and niacin-rich foods to lower cholesterol for heart disease. Of course, they didn't talk about cholesterol then, but he talked about nuts as being useful for the body's balance. And we now know that nuts actually increase the good cholesterol. And niacin actually can decrease bad cholesterol.
That's right.
But everything he talked about was about cleansing the body. He said most of our problems come from our bodies being out of balance. We were usually too acidic, and he talked about alkalizing the body. I think the highest selling book the ARE has ever put out with their publishing house has to do with alkalizing your body. In fact, I think it's called Alkalize or Die. And that remains the best-selling book. And a lot of people follow that Cayce prescription. But, of course, they do a lot more. The ARE has conferences there every year. They have a university. They have a master's degree. They have all kinds of online courses and study groups. It's just amazing. And tours. They're going to Cuba this year, which is pretty astonishing because I was pushing to go to Cuba some years ago. And it had to do with Andrew Collins speculating that a part of Cuba had been Atlantis. So the ARE is going there, but they cannot go to this specific site yet. So I'm waiting to go to this particular part of Cuba at some later date. Hopefully.
That would be exciting, especially if that possibility happened.
Well, absolutely. And Cuba remains a dark area with archaeology, meaning almost nothing has been done in Cuba archaeologically.